Good morning. My name's Tim Williams. I'm an English solicitor living in Finland. I spent 2 years down here in Dubai and still have a couple of cases in the region that I regard as a sort of form of failed ADR, because arbitration is a lot of fun, but it's not really very good for my company. So I'm kind of coming at it from basically an industry perspective. My company makes power plants. So that's electric power plants producing electricity. We do most of that by way of EPC contracting. So that's the full turnkey contract for engineering, procurement, construction. And those are the challenging contracts we have. In addition to that, our services colleagues are selling long-term O&M, so operations and maintenance contracts. And a large part of our customer base is utilities. So state-owned enterprises, utilities, as well as IPPs who sell power to utilities and industrials. And we have pretty much projects in, as far as I know, every country in the world except for North Korea and Cuba. So we have been around, and we've been doing this for 35 years. And to be fair, I've got 5 cases, as Virginia said. I regard those as the ones that escaped the ADR process and should perhaps have been resolved before they got to ADR. But basically I'm coming to this as a sort of industry player with some observations on how my cases ended up in arbitration, rather than, you know, what's the best way to mediate something. I think we know how to mediate by now, at least we should do. I would say though, of course, the US is a much deeper market for mediation and ADR than in my experience pretty much anywhere else in the world except the UK. So there's still a lot of resistance, which is why I think, you know, the base premise of this panel is mediation, is arbitration. Is it a forced compromise or suggested resolution? I think the compromise is not forced by anyone except yourself. The question is whether you can get there in a reasonable time frame. But in terms of our contracting, I think it's worth just touching on our contract structure, which is essentially 2-tier. When we get to the dispute clause. The first part is the informal, you know, what I call the escalation clause. But the moment a dispute arises, it's required to be escalated to senior management for a negotiation. And that's the most sort of traditional, I think, alternative dispute mechanism there is. It's always negotiated. And that's, you know, clearly the driver to early settlement and the kind of structures where we want to be. And that's as a matter of our corporate culture, that's where we end up. We are often negotiating. We are working on very long-term projects that it takes a year or 2 to develop, takes a year or 2 to build, and it takes 25 years to operate. So these are long-term projects. They cost a lot of money. We're talking about projects between 100 and 500 or 600 million euros. So I'm not GE up here, but they're still big projects. And then, you know, the other side of the 2-tier clause is arbitration. So you have ultra-informal negotiation and then ultra-formal arbitration. And I think ADR is in that gap, and that's where the opportunity is for us as counsel to add value. I think one of my colleagues yesterday was talking about adding value. I think for us, it's to get into that gap. And then, you know, this is where I struggle with some of my colleagues internally, because we have a lot of contracts on, say, FIDIC, Silver Book or Yellow Book, usually Silver, and then they strike out the clause that says this dispute should be referred to determination. I'm like, why did you strike it out? Oh, well, the other side didn't like it. Fine, you know, let's work on that. And I think that's a really important kind of reality gap to bridge, that we need to be able to be pushing these, not just with our counterparts, but with our own colleagues, because they're the ones who are negotiating at midnight, not just the law, but the dispute clause. And so I need to make sure that they get the message as well, that there are mechanisms, there are tools, and there's plenty of them. There's conciliation, mediation, determination, evaluation, and there's all the different techniques behind that. And I think we understand those. But from my side, it's the key is really to get in there, get into that gap. And I'm pushing very much at the moment for expert determination. If there's a technical engineering-related challenge, which it usually is in my business, you know, its experts are going to be far better at dealing with that than lawyers. Lawyers are useless. I have an MBA, but it doesn't make me an engineer. The second thing is I think we need to get is, you know, and determination is kind of useful. I'll touch on an experience with determination in a minute, but also it's the non-binding stuff that Rami mentioned. It's getting mediation clauses in there if we can, getting evaluation clauses in there. If there's, for example, a point of law, people always think there is a point of law, but it's quite nice in my experience to go to a QC in London and get him to say, well, you know, if this went to trial, this is how it would go. So you have that persuasive tool when you're in a settlement discussion to say, well, this is how it's going to go, and this is where we're going to end up. So it's about taking that opportunity, I think, to make a better world for ourselves. And then I shouldn't have 5 claims on my desk. That's just crazy in a business of my size. Anyway, moving forward, what I would like to touch on is a couple of the kind of observations I have on the failure of ADR internally. And this is not to say that we don't do it. We do it. We do have determinations. We do have mediations. And by and large, they're very successful. I think we even had a mediation in the marine team. I'm going to give you a new slide, a new picture. These slides are useless, by the way. They're just pretty pictures. But there was a mediation in the marine tide, and the very famous mediator called Stephen Ruttle came along, and the other side was extremely aggressive, and then they agreed to halt the mediation to go away and think about it. Well, that was 5 years ago, and the other side have not come back at all, and we're assuming that case is closed. So, you know, it does work, and I think, you know, Tom would be able to say, you know, mediation works extremely well. But, you know, recent experiences for me are about where ADR hasn't worked and where I am basically in arbitration. I'm going to speak to, but I'm thirsty. Thank you. Yeah, that's better. I've got one claim where there's a determination clause and an arbitration clause. And the other side is saying, well, the arbitration clause is the final resolution of the matter, therefore we're going to arbitration. So I'm like, well, what about the determination clause? They're like, no, you have to come and get us. Basically, these guys don't want to pay, they're broke, they're losing money, they're telling us we have to come after them. And I think in that case, we don't have any alternative. We're going to have to go for it. But such is life. On the other hand, I've got another claim where the other side is saying, and they note in the contract there's an amicable settlement obligation. And they're saying, well, if you come to Vienna, in the middle of Europe, on the 24th of January, we can have an amicable settlement discussion. If you don't come, we will have failed at our only attempt at amicable settlement. Right. I have to say a bit skeptical about that one. And I think under Swiss rules, that would not count as a reasonable and proper attempt at settlement. And they would have a struggle if and when they threaten to proceed into arbitration. And that's an interesting one because then clearly they haven't read their own rules. There's a very obscure set of rules that they've got in their contract, which we signed. I have to admit we signed. And the rules, the first thing they say, on the formation of the tribunal, we'll have a settlement meeting. Okay. So they're threatening us with a settlement meeting, which I think we can live with. We can probably manage to go for that one. The strange thing about those set of rules is they're not currently available in English. And we have English law, English language contract. So we're going to have a bit of a fight, I think, on that meeting about the rules of arbitration. And I think we're going to be proposing LCIA, ICC, Turkish, Istanbul, Egypt, anything but those rules, because right now I can't read them. And I think that would make enforcement a bit of a challenge, to be fair. Another example I have is FIDIC. You know, you have the multi-tier clause in FIDIC, and as I said, my colleagues quite like striking out the determination or the escalation clause. So we need to go back to train them, but also train our customers in what we think is reasonable in putting back into contracts. And I think a lot of people review this as a sort of, well, a dispute's going to go all the way anyway, so we may as well just strip out the crappy bits in the middle so we can just go straight to arbitration. And I think that's unfair because it's not really how the world works. Anyway, what else did I have? Not so much. last slide. That's actually what one of our engines looks like, by the way. There was a couple there, but you can see what they look like now, painted blue. One of the last observations I have, which is a bit more technical, is in relation to limits of authority. We have a lot of business with utilities, so they are state-owned enterprises, and they tend to come up with some pretty big claims, I think quite irrational claims, and then they instruct council to run really aggressive claims, and you're sort of thinking, well, where are we coming from here? And then it suddenly starts to occur to us that when we try and arrange a settlement meeting, no one shows up because no one has any authority to do anything. So the claim ends up going to the head of the authority, and then it goes to the head of the government ministry, and then it goes to the minister himself, and then it goes to the cabinet, and then it goes to the prime minister, it goes to the president. And so that's why the claims are not settling, because these are large infrastructure projects, they're worth 200, 300, 400 million, they're important to a region or a province or a country, and the president says, no, we want our 50 mil. And so we end up going all the way with council who are badly managed, at least not on my side, but the other side. And then we end up in massive claims with 4 or 5 million euros worth of cost, and then we win on the counterclaim. That has to change, and that's kind of one thing I would have really liked to see today. If there were any government representatives or utilities in this room, I would have been fascinated to ask them, what the hell do you think you're doing? Because that cannot be an effective way of doing business. Anyway, that would be kind of my final point, one that is really a acute challenge for me at the moment. But there you go. That's a power plant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much.